Put in his video. Now I have. Right.
Okay, good.
Okay, I can see there are 177 people in the room, so that means we're fine. So, in fact, it's going up. So there we are. So this morning or this afternoon, I'm going to be discussing with John Schlapoberskey his book, When They Came For Me, The Hidden Diary of an Apartheid Prisoner. John, firstly, let me congratulate you on this book. It is a quite extraordinary achievement. And the obvious first question to pose to you is, why did it take you 50 years to write it?
52 exactly.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
There's a very.
Why did it take 52 years to write it?
Okay, there's a very simple explanation. I didn't want to present myself to the world as one of life's victims. It was a dreadful ordeal. It's not the kind of ordeal you ever leave behind you. You can celebrate it's over, and you can celebrate that the cause you stood for, which is the liberation of South Africa, is a reality. But the ordeal itself is never far away. It's at the back of your shoulder sometimes. So, as a practitioner in my field, I'm a psychotherapist and a clinician and a trauma specialist. I wanted to produce, first of all, a book about my practice, what I do, how I work. I'm a part of a much wider movement of psychotherapists that we call group analysts. And we work with groups of people in the belief that we need the resources of many to address and resolve the problems of one. And I produced my first book, From the Couch to the Circle, in 2016. It was only after that book had come out and been well received that I thought I could write the next one, which had to be about my history. And so that's why it's taken so long.
Can I ask you, but what is unique about your book compared to, let's say, and you very graciously mention a whole host of books towards the end of your experiences, is that you're a trained therapist, a distinguished one at that. And so I suppose my first question is, how much of this was therapeutic, of writing about 5 days in detention with dreadful people like Roy Swanepoel and Coetzee, who was then Major Coetzee, became General Coetzee. This couldn't have been, even 50 years later, couldn't have been easy to deal with.
Certainly not easy to deal with, never easy to deal with, but necessary. And I want to be free of these people insofar as I can be. I mean, they're both dead now. How I would have gone about writing this if I knew that they were alive and if they were going to be reading this, I can't really say. But some of the people who are junior to them are still around. I don't know quite where they are. And it's likely they are listening to this webinar now. And what I want to be able to say to them is that right is not on your side, and history has proved the darkness of your deeds and misdeeds. So this is a communication not only to my fellow survivors, it's also a communication to the perpetrators, and it's also written to perpetrators wherever they may be.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but we'll continue as best I can under the situation. Just occasionally I lose you, John. But I wanted to ask you about that, because in the foreword to the book, written by Albie Sachs, which was a very moving and in Albie style, very eloquently written foreword, he says, John does not use the language of soft vengeance as I did, as Albie himself did when he wrote his book about the soft vengeance of a freedom fighter. But he too is involved himself in a project of reparation. It's a form of reparation to be accomplished not in terms of money paid out as compensation for pain inflicted, not even of solace offered for suffering endured, but through the establishment of human connections and the regeneration of optimism in those who have been severely bruised in spirit and rendered deeply sad in soul. So I'm interested, he says you don't use the language of soft vengeance, but it seems to me, I think, that you probably do.
Well, I guess he's differentiating between soft vengeance as a judicial pursuit, which has been part of your own life story, Dennis, and it's a story in which those of us who've endured standing on a brick are really very indebted to you as well as to Albie. I've pursued it as a therapeutic quest. And the person who most eloquently gives words to what it is I'm about in this book and all the other writing I do is one of our very first clients at the organization I established with my late friend and colleague, Helen Bamber. We called the organization the Medical Foundation for Victims of Torture. It wasn't a good term at all. It's now called Freedom from Torture.
Yes. Yeah.
And one of our very first clients was an Iranian man who, when I started work with him, looked much like my mother's description of me when she came to see me on her second visit. When she came to see me in Swanepoel's office in the Compol building in Pretoria. And she said in her account of this that I was distracted, I couldn't speak, I didn't even realize that sound wasn't coming out of my mouth. I opened and closed my mouth like a fish.
Yes, you describe that quite. It's very frightening to describe that as you describe it in the book. Yes.
Yes, it's my mother's description.
Yes.
And it's the state of mind I was presented with by an Iranian client of ours when he was brought to us by his older brother. He had just come here after 3 years in Evin prison, just outside Tehran. And it took years to work with him to help him regain himself. And towards the end of the work, he said, "Thank you. Yours is the hand of humanity that reaches out to save me from drowning in my sorrow." Now that hand of humanity, call it what you will, soft vengeance, judicial pursuit of justice, this is the hand of humanity, and this is my own quest in my therapeutic work. He said something else that's equally significant, a story which I like to share with people. He told me during the course of his therapy that they'd put him in a punishment cell on the top of the prison that had no roof, so they were exposed to the weather, hot sun in summer and snow in winter. And at one point he was there with an old peasant from the mountains who didn't know one piece of politics from another, but he'd done something wrong. And the guards liked to torment him, beat him. And he came to this old man one day, he said, he was a teacher before his imprisonment, and he said, "Old man, we can't strike them back, but whilst we're here, I'm going to teach you to read and to write, and that will be our vengeance." And this is the quest. It's a quest that Albie is the most eloquent representative of that we know. And I'm honored to serve in a similar way.
So let me just take you back then. People will read this book for themselves, and they will doubtless come to their own conclusions. But there are a number of aspects I want to raise with you. It's clearly so. You were very young at the time. I mean, early 20s, as I understand.
I was 21. I just had my birthday.
Yes. Did you get mixed up in a whole range of things that you didn't understand at the time?
No.
Let me put, I don't mean it in a condescending way. Sorry. What I mean by that is someone slightly different. So I'm asking the question inelegantly. Let me put it in a slightly different way. Many of the people that I interviewed and my own experience of, which was, of course, in the 80s, was such that not everybody, but many of the people who were in detention kind of knew the game because they had been active for a long time in various movements, whether it be the ANC, the UDF, the trade union movement, etc. They were sort of, if I could put it this way, almost mentally prepared because they knew the risks. I didn't get the impression reading your book that was so.
On the contrary, I lived in Johannesburg with the British passport that came from Swaziland.
Yes.
I'd been raised in Swaziland. I'd been there all my teenage years at school. Two of my uncles were at the bar. They were QCs at the Johannesburg bar. You probably
one was Oshri, if I recall correctly.
Yes,
from the
that's
book.
my aunt's husband. The other was Charles Rosenthal.
I was trying to work out who the other one was. Okay, great.
And
keep going.
My father's older brother was the mayor of Johannesburg at that time. It never occurred to me that I could be arrested for any. I never did anything that warranted arrest. I mean, we were defiant about the terms of what was called petty apartheid. So I was interested in poetry, and I met black writers. One in particular, Mongane Wale Serote.
Yes, clearly had an influence on you. Yeah.
Well, it's not so much that he had an influence. We were young writers together. He's only 3 years older than me.
Oh, okay.
But what I discovered as we got to know each other was that he was better educated than any of my university teachers. He'd been at secondary school in Soweto and then in Maseru. He was self-educated, an immensely knowledgeable man. And what we were grappling with was a struggle in which to find words to talk about desolation and horror. We were struggling with this and trying to do it in poetry. I was intrigued by him, and I met others like him too. Oswald Mchali had not yet brought out his first anthology called Sounds of a Cowhide Drum. But I was a member of Lionel Abrams' poetry writing circle. Lionel was not yet a celebrated figure in the way he went on to become. But in my book, I've recorded in the section on the literature of imprisonment and resistance that a pivotal figure was Oswald Mchali, but another equally pivotal figure was Herman Charles Bosman, who'd spent time in the same prison I was held in, listening to the gallows at work. And he wrote a memoir about his prison life called Cold Stone Jug.
Yeah, very famous.
Lionel Abrams was born with severe cerebral palsy, and he was not well enough to attend a normal school. His committed, benevolent parents, dedicated to his education, found him the best personal mentor they could, which turned out to be Herman Charles Bosman. So there's a line of development from Bosman in prison becoming a writer to Lionel Abrams becoming a writer and an editor. And he ran this small circle of, a workshop for a small circle of writers. I introduced Wally to the circle. And we used to go there together, and we were all under the influence, really, of Lionel. And then we were arrested. And that was the end of my South African life, really.
Yes, I realize that, and I want to come back to that, if I may, because it's not unimportant. But that's, in a sense, what, for me, singled out, as it were, your narrative to some of the others that, one, I've read, two, whom with engaged, and three, my own personal experiences, which was that by the late 70s into the 80s, one knew the risks. One knew that if one was going to actually get involved in UDF or ANC politics or union politics, there was a chance, frankly, not only of detention, but of death.
Yeah.
Because the people who you describe, Roy Raswanapul and General Kutsi, were hardly the people that I wanted to go and have a drink at a bar mitzvah with. I mean, these were serious, awful thugs. And I want to come back to Kutsi in a moment, well, both of them, if I may. But I suppose that's the point, is that the way this is described, which makes it even more, for me, pathetic in the Greek sense of the word. And I mean this in a sense of sheer riveting sadness, is that what you come across as a 21-year-old is an incredibly decent human being who really wanted to live in a non-racial society and saw that as absolutely crucial to your further existence, which you saw in South Africa.
Yeah.
And really you are then brought in and spend literally a week on a brick and 50 odd days in solitary for that particular purpose. I mean, so I suppose the question I have for you then is, where did you, when you reflect upon it, where did the hidden strength come in to actually resist this? Because because there's no doubt that I mean, I was thinking to myself, well, what would I have done on 5 days on a brick? Or how would I have done it if I mean, anybody reading this who essentially was politically orientated, who may have had a similar experience or tangential experience, would be putting themselves in your position. And I was thinking of, as a 21-year-old, how on earth did you find the strength to actually keep going?
Well, we knew these people were the enemy. We knew that.
Yeah.
When we had demonstrations at WITS or at UCT, when I was there the year before, they were there in the background taking pictures of us. We saw them in their little beetles going around, you know, and we'd tell nasty jokes about them. I've given a catalogue of my own exposure to police prior to my arrest, and you know, it's significant and interesting. In fact, when they did arrest me and they took me to where I lived and searched the place, amongst the things they were looking for were the photographs they believed I had taken of them. Because, you know, I was and always have been an outspoken person, and I feel it's essential to be to stand by what you believe in. And we were having a demonstration, and all those students would stand along the road at Jan Smuts Avenue outside WITS, and our demonstration was about the legislation that debarred Arthur Mafiji from taking up his teaching position at UCT. You would have been around at that time.
No, I wasn't. I was a kid at school at that time. But the truth about it was that I had become very friendly with people who were very involved in that, including Rafi Kaplinski, now a very serious economist, developmental economist, with whom I've had the honor of writing an article with him, and his colleague Mike Morris also was there. So I know all about it, but I wasn't there. They were. Yeah.
They were. Okay. Yeah. Well, we were having our street demonstration, and the police came to take pictures of us. And I thought, bloody hell, this is terrible. You know, they're intimidating us, they're recording us. So I went to one of my friends. His name is Johnny Wax. He may be going to listen to this at some point. He's a filmmaker in the USA. He was the editor of Vid Student. And I said, can you lend me one of your cameras? And he said, we haven't got any film. And I said, it doesn't matter. I just want the camera. So then I rushed back to the street demonstration and started taking pictures of these policemen. Now, they didn't know the camera was empty, but they all ran away. So then we could continue with our demonstration. And when they arrested me, they were convinced I had a whole catalogue of their pictures. They tore the house to pieces. Well, of course, I had no pictures, but that's how I was, and it's how I have always been.
But now you're there. And everything tells me, because not just experience, but the literature tells me too, that when you're captive of these people, that's a totally different world, because the rules have totally changed. You have no control over any of your rules. So I'm still fascinated. As a 21-year-old, when you reflect on this, how did you get yourself through this?
Well, you'll see that at the point at which I'm brought face to face with Swanepoel,
yes,
and these three police who took me off the campus quietly, insidiously, who keep assuring me that I'll see a lawyer in Pretoria. And I get there, and they take me into this big room, and there's a guy standing, supervising a team of other people who are going through all my things that they've taken from the house. And I look at all my stuff strewn out there, and my father's typewriter, and my girlfriend's typewriter, and these guys just turn on me and start shouting in Afrikaans. And I'm expecting to see a lawyer, and this is how I'm greeted. And I say to the guy who looks to be in charge, excuse me, please, can I see a lawyer? And it's a bit like putting a match to a fuse for an explosion, because he went off like a bomb, swearing at me in Afrikaans, abusing my face, my Jewish nose, you bloody Jews, communists, long harangue. Now, I don't know where the chutzpah came from, but I said to him very quietly, like Oliver Twist in Charles Dickens' story, "Excuse me, please, sir, but if you want me to answer your questions, would you ask them in English, because I don't know what you're saying?" Now, he didn't like that. He gave me such hell. Now, that kind of chutzpah didn't last for very long, not because he beat me very severely, but because he and his team then crowded me into a tiny interrogation room, closed the big safe door. This room, Compol building, was Paul Kruger's bank during the Transvaal Republic. And it still had big Chubb doors on it, made by the British safe manufacturers. The sound of that door closing and the lock going on it to cut the street out felt like the end of my life. I thought I would die there. And then I had to turn in. Now, I wasn't conscious at the time of where I turned to, but the person I turned to was my girlfriend, and I imagined her as a kind of guardian angel. And she was with me in my mind throughout that time. She'll be at the book launch on Sunday the 13th, and our children have grown up with strength and
because
value.
she became your wife at one point. I know it's your ex-wife now, but she was your wife. Yeah,
we married afterwards.
Yes.
And we have two children.
Is this a kind of Viktor Frankl type thing, where the meaning and you had to hold on to meaning, and she was your meaning?
Indeed. This was the first stage, the day-by-day survival. Then I befriended the brick I was standing on. The brick and I made friends. And I used to say to the brick, because they let me off the brick to go to the toilet or to sit down for a meal. And then it didn't hurt for the first few hours, but as the time marched on, it got very, very hard getting back up onto that brick. So I used to say to the brick, this wonderful song from Paul Simon, "Hello, darkness, my old friend.
Yes, wonderfully
I'll
moving.
talk to you again."
Yeah.
And I used to say to the brick, "I won't hurt you if you won't hurt me. Let's do this together. Just be gentle to me and don't torment my feet." So there is an element of the psychoanalytic enterprise that looks for the inner connection with benevolent figures.
That's very
Unfortunately for me, I had them. They came from my parents, my brothers and my sister, and they came from our history, because my father was a troubled and vulnerable man in his own way, but he was also very big, very strong, and a hero from World War II. And we regarded him as, a kind of heroic figure. He brought the spirit of a kind of grim defiance into what he did. But his uncle, whose name was Sodik, my brother Colin is named for him, Sodik, he was a figure who was put at the execution site by the Nazi executioners and the Lithuanians when they were killing them in August 1941 in Lithuania. And he was the leader of the Jewish community in this little town called Kedan. And there was one survivor from a community of 3,500 Jews. And this survivor had hidden in a woodpile in one of the sheds in which they were storing people until they killed them. And this guy watched what was happening through the broken planks of the woodshed. And what he saw was that when they told Sodik to take off his overcoat, they wanted the coat before they killed the man. He refused. So the Nazi executioner came to strip it off him, and my uncle pulled the gun out of his holster and tried to turn it on him, but he couldn't make the safety catch work. So he grabbed him and jumped into the pit with him and killed him in the pit. And then he killed one of the Lithuanians before the others jumped in and killed him with their knives. Now, this is a terrible story. Even as I tell it to you now, my blood runs cold on it. The handful of rabbinic survivors from that community of between 250, 500,000 Jews of Lithuania, there were a handful of rabbis who survived the Holocaust. One of them, a man named Rabbi Ephraim Oshry, same name as my uncle. He visited South Africa in 1949 or 1950 from Israel to bring people there news of what had befallen their families. And I have newspaper cuttings of his visit to Johannesburg. And he gives an account of it in a book he wrote some years later called Hurban Liter, The Destruction of the Sacred Communities of Lithuanian Jewry. So we have these elements of survival and resistance, not only in our family life, but in our history too.
Well, I want to come back to the history if I may, but I'd like to do that a little bit later. Just to remind everybody, because I keep on forgetting because I'm so idiotic at this, please ask your any comments or questions you'd like to put in the chat line. I will come to them, but I'd like to just carry on for a number of minutes because there are so many questions. I think I could carry on for hours, but I'd like to just try to develop slightly further. Let me ask you this, John. Let's talk about the other side, that is the evil side. So, I mean, you're now a therapist of world distinction. You must have reflected upon this. What kind of men were these who were torturing you? You must have thought about this deeply.
Many times, and I would like...
So, Swanepoel, I mean, they're dead. Some of Swanepoel's dead, but I mean, Roy Swanepoel was a really dreadful human being. But I'm interested in your take on him, because you know, he loomed so large. You must still have loomed large afterwards in your life.
Oh, yeah. Well, it opens another door, which is the door to Afrikaners, which is very important for me. My mother grew up as an Afrikaanse Jood on a farm in the Magaliesberg, just outside Krugersdorp. Her parents, their own marriage was late in her father's life. He'd already lost a wife and child in childbirth, living in the Cape Town area. And after this tragic loss, sometime in the late 1890s, he did well enough as an accountant to buy a farm. The scale of these farms compared to land propriety is extraordinary. It was 2,000 morgen. Now, I don't know how that translates, but it was miles in extent. And he was a quiet and lonely, remote, reclusive figure, but he was informed by his own Bundist history, that is the socialist movement amongst Jews in Eastern Europe. And sadly, he was killed in a rail accident on his farm 3 years before I was born, in 1945, during World War II. But on our visits to the farm and from family history passed on to us, we knew him as a visionary man who befriended everybody. During the Boer War, he was against the British. He was on the side of the Boers, and he hid the farm's horses in the dining room and the kitchen of their farmhouse so that the khakis, the British soldiers, wouldn't sequester them, and he passed them on to the Boers instead. That's the kind of man he was.
Yeah.
My mother was his only child, and she grew up speaking Afrikaans. And she passed on to us stories of the people they lived amongst, who called themselves die bitter einders, people who had yet to reconcile themselves to the end of the Boer War. Now, so far as I know, the influence of this section of Afrikanerdom, subject to vanquishment by 2 wars of conquest by the British Empire, and the devastating losses of the concentration camps during the Anglo-Boer War. Trauma begets trauma. And I have no doubt that when the Voortrekker Monument was put up in the late 1930s by Milan, there were many heart-sore people there. many imbittered people. And the nature of the hatred that I saw from Swanepoel and Coetzee towards the British, towards the fact that I carried a British passport, it was even worse than the hatred for communists. It was
but I mean, with respect, even if you hadn't had a British passport, Swanepoel had hatred to anybody.
Well, if I hadn't had a British passport, I don't know, what would have become of me, because...
Well, he wouldn't listen. He wouldn't have sent you a Hanukkah or Christmas card. What I'm trying to say is, he would have hated you nonetheless.
Of course he did, and I felt his hatred. I knew it,
But what was fueling him? Was it the history that you just described?
I have no doubt it was this history. No doubt. He wasn't a very informative man. He didn't deign to talk much to me, but his fellow major, these were two majors who were in charge of this whole wave of arrests that took place in the winter of 1969. And Swanepoel and Coetzee were the two who ran the show. Coetzee was much more informative.
Well, that's what you say. He was you describe Coetzee as a really intelligent guy.
Well, I think Swanepoel was intelligent like a wounded buffalo is intelligent. Dangerous, venomous, calculating, cunning, and merciless.
Okay.
No lack of intelligence, but
that was true of the people.
Intelligence, like the terrible Nazi figures.
Yes, but when you have an engagement with Coetzee, I found it fascinating that you had the courage to basically say to him, mate, this ain't going to last. I mean, my words, not yours. Yeah. This ain't going to last forever. And he was really cocky about this. We've got this all under control. He believed that. I mean, what is so fascinating about it sort of freezes time at a moment, and this is relevant. Some questions coming up, I want to come to them. It's relevant to the fact of any form of oppression, it seems to me, that it's extraordinary that these people didn't believe that actually time would pass them by.
Yeah.
Because the struggle would win.
Yeah. Coetzee was so assured of his own position. And the fact is that this whole enterprise, a state run by its security police, creates a state of terror. It was, through all those years, a state of terror. State terror, and its use was sanctioned from the top.
So could I just ask you this? You come, there's so much I want to ask you about this, but I need to move on because there's so much else. So when I want to come back to you coming out, but I'd like to just ask this. You know that from your time on, even from before your time, but certainly through the 70s, the courts convicted people on the evidence that people like yours, not you, but people who were in detention gave. And you must have thought about this on the basis that it would be, after a while, would it have been, much of this evidence must have been utterly unreliable. I mean, and yet courts just accepted it.
Well, there was one other white arrested at the time that I was.
Who was that? Yes, out of interest.
His name was Golding. I'd never met him. I didn't know who he was.
Yeah.
But his cross-examination as a state witness was described to me by a lawyer living currently in London who is part of a WITS team of legal trainees who made a small committee to be court observers and to attend the trial that took place 6 months after our arrests. The trial was called The Case of Winnie Mandela, Joyce Sikakane, and the 20 co-accused. All the evidence there was against these people was based on the interrogation of suspects. So I don't know what they did to Golding, but there were other state witnesses too, black state witnesses. And I have no doubt they used their most advanced techniques of cruelty and horror to extract whatever they could from these people. But the senior lawyer here in London who described the case to me, he would have been 22 or 23 at the time and a legal trainee attending court to watch. And he said that the defense lawyer, Sogart,
Yes, David Sogart, yes.
David Sogart, he went to Golding in the witness box, who was shaking like a leaf, and said to him very quietly, "Were you frightened or hurt under interrogation?" And he said very quietly, "Yes." And he said, "Are any of the people who frightened or hurt you here in this courtroom?" And he pointed out either Swanepoel or Kutsi, I don't know which one was there. And he said, "Did they give you an offer that you could go home to London if you gave this evidence?" And he said, "Yes." And then he said to the judge, "I have no further questions, Your Honor." And the judge closed the case down. 5 minutes later, whichever police officer was in the court, Swanepoel or Kutsi, they rearrested all the defendants and put them straight back into prison for another 6 months of solitary confinement.
When you sorry, carry on.
Well, it was at this point that I got my own article published in the Observer.
Yes.
To bring attention to what had been done to me in order to put strength in the hands of the defense team. Because the person who was running the defense program was Joel Carlton. And I'm sure you were a junior to him at some point, or knew him.
I knew him.
Yeah. I mean, he did a remarkable service to the detainees, and his book, No Neutral Ground, is a very important testimony to those terrible times.
So let me just move on then. I mean, it's curious that at some point, the Israelis get involved with you through Una, who I think was the consul general and then became the ambassador when we upgraded. Yeah. But Una, of course, was a Labour Party man. I think he wasn't part of the present lot. Yeah. And I'm curious about that. Why would they? I mean, was it such a strange combination? Because it seems to me, from the way you describe your book, at some point they had a conundrum. Because they must have known you weren't going to lead them to the promised land, their promised land, so they could run trials against all sorts of people who were going to bring down the regime. And on the other hand, they didn't want to let you go. It was a catch-22. How on earth did Israel get involved in this? Well, and let me just make one other point. Let me make one other point, because you more than refer to it, and I'd like you to. The Jewish community would not have been happy with you. The established community, they could not stand those of us on the left, because we encouraged them and we compromised them.
They turned their backs on us.
Yes,
my mother was the one who was the kind of architect of the fight back from the outside, and she appealed to whoever she could get help from, and she got no help at all, even from relatives, friends and family who were closest to us. But I want the opportunity here to say that the one person who was my mother's closest lifelong friend, they'd been at Bernata Park School together, was a woman named Marcel Feldman. And Marcel's home at 9 Craddock Heights, Craddock Avenue, Rosebank, had been a sort of sanctuary place for us to visit whenever we came to Joburg from Swaziland. And Marcel gave over the use of her home to the defense team, the lawyer Raymond Tucker, the editor of the Rand Daily Mail, I can't remember his first name, was Lowe. Mm-mm. And they used to have kind of councils of war there to work out a strategy about what to do. And it was from that address that my mother then wrote a letter to the Prime Minister, appealing to him for access to me, because this is now...
Yes, it's in the book.
It's in the book. That letter's in the book. Because I was allowed one visit after 2 weeks, and then nothing for a month. And the month that follows was the month in which they kept putting razor blades on the wash basin they took me to in the bathroom. because in that intervening period after my first visit, my parents were authorized to send in washing equipment, including a razor. And but I was never allowed to have a blade for the razor. They'd give me a blade to shave, and they'd take it back. But then after a certain point, I'd go into the bathroom. It was a bathroom I recognized. And the reason I recognized it is because there'd been 2 deaths in detention in which there'd been proceedings in court. And I can't remember if it was Sogart or Unterhalter, one of the defense lawyers, who'd led the defense or the inquiry on behalf of the families whose relatives had been killed, we think, by Swanepoel. One of them, the claim goes, had slipped on a bar of soap in the bathroom.
Yeah.
And fractured his skull, and that's how he died. Now, there's a bathroom described in the newspapers in the months before my arrest, and then I found myself in that same bathroom. And then I kept finding razor blades there, and I became convinced that they were trying to get me to kill myself. I think they were. So my mother's letter to the Prime Minister, and then the stand she took, she took advice from our remarkable lawyer, Raymond Tucker.
Wonderful lawyer. Please, you mentioned him.
Yeah. And, he said to her, look, there's nothing I can do for you legally. This terrorist act closes down the operation of the law. But what I can do is guide you, and you must proceed now as a mother. And so she went to the Wachthuis, the headquarters of Brigadier van den Berg, which was in the early days of the Bureau of State Security. And she sat there and she said, I'm here to talk to the Brigadier because I want to see my son. And she sat there the whole day. She wouldn't go. And eventually they took her to see him. And then I think she had a kind of breakdown. She got wild and shouted, cried. And then he phoned Swanepoel. And Swanepoel said, okay, well, she can come and visit him tomorrow. Then she had a second visit with me, and that's when she found me unable to speak. Now, it was she then who led the effort to persuade the Israeli Consul General to take an interest in my case. But he replied to her and said, look, there's nothing I can do, actually, because your son's a British subject and a South African subject. I have no role in the matter. And she said, but the security police would listen to you if you were to appeal to them to release him so he could go and join his brother in Israel. So he said, well, maybe, but I can't take any initiative. So she went back to the security police and said, contact Major Una. He will do something. And that's how it all unfolded.
Wow.
Now, what their interest was, it has to be said, is twofold.
Yes, what?
One was from the records that have been unearthed from the Israeli archives, from the Israeli Foreign Ministry. He writes to his superiors from Pretoria to Tel Aviv to say, John is in the hands of this man Swanepoel, who we know to be responsible, according to the English press, for the deaths of many in detention. I think he knew that I was in the hands of a murderer.
Yeah, sure he would have.
And that first meeting I had with him, I could feel the sincerity of his personal concern for me. But then the other set of motives has to do with what became of South Africa and Israel's toenadering, all the covert operations that then took place.
Yeah. Can I then, because of time, I wanted to ask you, did you give evidence at the TRC?
No, I chose not to.
Why not?
Well, at the time I thought I can't go to proceedings where people who have lost limbs, loved ones, or the entirety of their health and say, these guys put me on a brick. It seemed to me to have no proportionality. Now, I have to say that at that time, I think I was still under the influence of what these terrible people had done to me.
Yes, because if you take that logic now, then you shouldn't have published your book. Because
Exactly.
people could have said, well, why is he publishing a book? I mean, okay, he was in the brick for 5 days, tough, but Neil Agate was murdered and this one had electric shock and so on and so forth. So was it that at that point you hadn't yet come to terms with what had happened to you?
Well, of course I had, but actually life was never easy for me. I came here as a refugee with nothing, and started a degree for the third time. My family at home collapsed, and my younger brothers and sister came to live with me. We were struggling.
Yeah.
It was hard.
Yeah.
And you asked me another question about, why the book at this stage. It's not until I'd written and published my previous book, From the Couch to the Circle, that I thought, now I'm going to come forward to present the detail of what actually happened.
John, there's so many other questions but I want to get to the audience who've been patiently. There's some questions, but one final question relating to that. Did you think the TRC was a good mechanism, or would you have liked General Coetzee and Brigadier Swanepoel, as they became, to have been prosecuted, both for murder and for the kinds of crimes that they perpetrated on people like you, changed your life forever, murdered people, changed many people's lives forever? You're a testament to that.
Yeah. I'm pleased you've asked this question, and I have a very clear set of views, but how closely they correspond to any historical reality, I just don't know.
It's fine.
But I heard Richard Goldstone give an account of how the TRC was born at the first Psychoanalytic Congress in Cape Town in 1998. And he described how throughout the urban centers of South Africa, following the appeal by Winnie Mandela to make the townships ungovernable, and they were succeeding, and the police were coming in their Caspers and shooting people left, right, and center from these armored cars, and there was a standoff in Angola, Namibia, between the Cuban tanks and the South African Defence Force that had now been encircled. And this was such a critical deadline, and people were being assassinated by covert operations squads, which had been trained up by Swanepoel and others. And what was stopping the apartheid government from entering into negotiations with the ANC was the question of reprisals. What would become of apartheid's chief agents? And so they said, well, we'll have a TRC. And apparently the judges were very unhappy about this. And they convened a meeting of people who had suffered atrocity. And amongst these people was the widow of a man from the Eastern Cape, part of a team of ANC underground operatives. They'd caught this man, chopped him up, and buried his body in pieces. But his widow didn't know where they were. And there were other such people at this series of hearings, which I'm sure you know much more about than me. But what I want to get to is the emotional point. At a certain point, this woman was saying, I just want to know where he's buried. I just want the truth. And she started to weep. And the man sitting next to her was Albie, who reached out the stump of his injured arm to comfort her. And then apparently everybody wept, including the judges. And that was the catalyst for the agreement for the TRC. Now, that's the spirit of conciliation and compassion, and that's the spirit in which the TRC was founded. But clearly it lost its way dreadfully, because these architects of state terror, of course they should have been prosecuted. And thinking about the three Slovo women, Sean, Gillian, and Robin, sitting at the hearing of the TRC, was Coetzee saying, well, the murder of Ruth First was a mistake, as if, he slipped on a bar of soap. It was a calculated strategy of murder, assassination, and state terror. And its architects should have been in the dock. Of course they should.
Thank you for being so candid. I'm going to ask a few questions from the audience, and then I want to make one final comment. So let me just go in the order in which they were asked. Andrew says, please can you ask John what is his comment on what is happening between Israel and Palestinians at the moment, in the light of his experience?
Well, there's a situation of more state terror. And I think it's atrocious, just atrocious.
Thank you.
I think the conduct of the Israeli state towards, can't comment so much about Israeli Arabs, because it's a different kind of policy. But Israeli conduct in relation to Gaza and the West Bank, this is inexcusable.
Thank you for your candor. Charles asks, I firmly believe that the TRC was a fudge, and in retrospect, we should have had something resembling the Nuremberg trials. You've partly answered that, but if there's anything you'd like to add to Charles, I'd be very happy to let you do that.
Well, I think that's exactly what should have happened, that a selected panel of the key leaders of the repressive machinery should have been investigated in the dock and in public, because I believe they misled their own people as grievously as they injured everybody else. And among the most moving things happening for me right now in the course of writing this book is coming back to the Afrikaans that was my mother's language, her first language. And, I've written in my book about how the experience of seeing de Klerk take his oath of office under Mandela as the deputy president. This was, at the 1994 inauguration, we were watching from here, enthralled and deeply moved. And then when de Klerk took his oath of office, unlike Mandela and Mbeki, he took his oath of office in Afrikaans. And as he did so, he wept from his heart. And we wept with him. And it was a reparative moment of deep and profound consequence. And it allowed me to come back to a language that actually I love and enjoy listening to.
I can't help then ask this, John. They took you out of South Africa at 21 years old. Clearly a country which even to this day you have deep roots in. Do you resent the fact, notwithstanding the fact that you've built up a serious reputation of great distinction in your field, that they prevented you from making the kind of contribution that doubtless at 21 years old you envisaged that you would make to the sort of non-racial society that you dreamt of?
It's a big question, Dennis, and I don't know how to answer it, because when people come and join us at the book launch on Sunday the 13th, we fixed this book launch for the 13th of June because it's exactly 52 years to the day since I was arrested. I was arrested at Wits on Friday the 13th of June. So we're having our launch on Sunday the 13th. And I'm just going to tell people now that you can join us by...
Yes, please. Yeah.
Have people been given this URL to get onto the launch? Let me do it now. So you put in www.tiny, TINYURL.com, WZTM. And that'll bring you to the Sunday launch. But you need to do that now, over the next few days, to get registered. And then you'll get a Zoom number and you can come and join us. So in the prelude to the actual launch event, at which Albie will be speaking and Gillian Slover will be interviewing me, and my own wonderful family will be responsible for the event. We're having a preview of a slideshow of South African music, but the interposition of images of grace and beauty, which is our landscape, and then brutality and horror. Now, you knew that yourself in the 80s and were inspired, to challenge what was going on. And I do admire what you did. I'm not sure I could have survived that period, that extended period. It went on, all the way to 94. I have no idea what would have become of me.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, John. To which I suppose we all have to have our own individual answers. Can I just ask you? I just want to ask one final question. And Faisal says, "Could you give the www again, please?"
Yes, I'm not sure I'm reading it correctly.
Okay, well, if you wouldn't mind, just one final time.
So it's www.tinyurl.com WZTM. Now, if you don't mind, I'm just going to check the email thing. I may not have given you.
Well, where could they go?
This is rather embarrassing.
Doesn't matter.
www.tinyurl.com/WTCFM.
Thank you.
Shall I repeat that?
Yeah. One final time. I'm getting all these people asking for you to repeat it.
Okay.
Is it possible that it can be sent by, I don't know whether, if you send it to Nicole, then perhaps she could just email me.
Nicole has it already, so I'll ask Kelly Maverick to send it out. But
fair.
I'll repeat it again, and you're all very welcome. We've created a forum.
Very good. I'm sure people would like to do that because I've got it in at the hour, but I'm sure she'll do that if that's okay. I wanted to end, John, by just reading something, which, when I began this book, and I hope everybody will buy the book and everybody will read the book. And I gather that copies can be procured even through the Daily Maverick, as I understand it. But when you finish the very interesting foreword by Albie, the book starts with a little fragment that you wrote in January 1969. 3 men flew to the moon last night, and a little girl died without ever having seen it. An enteritis killed her, they all say. Just 100 of their $1 billion a mile trip would have let her see the moon. An enteritis killed her, they all say. I found that extraordinarily moving. It seemed to me that you were punished for actually asking that question of our own society, which killed so many black people who were essentially killed because they were black and poor and because they were disregarded. And so this book, to some extent, makes us reflect on that history in a very profound way. Somebody put the comment up, and let me finish with this, that they hope that people like F.W. Clerk et al. Would have listened to this particular exchange. So do I hope that they would listen to this exchange. John Schlapoberskey, thank you very, very much.
I'm grateful for this platform.
And thank you very much for writing the book.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody. Stay safe.
Bye.
Bye-bye.